Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have you here today on our webinar, Operationalizing Locally Led Development, part of our series on the topic, Reimagining Risk and Accountability. Humentum will be presenting with panelists from the CHS Alliance, Civicus, Radical Flexbility Fund, and USAID. We are very grateful for them being here, and we look forward to a lively conversation, both with our panelists and all of you in the chat. Before we get started, I would like to thank Humentum's industry partners who help support our networks, community, and the sector with their expertise, knowledge, and resources. Before we get started, I am going to go over a few housekeeping items. So first, I would like to highlight that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be shared with all of you through email. You should receive that email this Friday. So by the end of the week, that should be in your inbox with the recording, as well as several other resources and links. In addition to those links, we will also have the registration link for our next webinar in the locally led development series. That will be on September 7th, I think is the date. So keep an eye out for that as well. And that will be, again, in your inbox Friday by the end of this week. Additionally, we are including captioning. So if you need that or would appreciate having captioning as the presenters are speaking, you can turn that on or off, if that's your preference, by clicking the bottom of your Zoom screen, and it will say either live transcript or subtitles or captioning, depending on which update of Zoom you have. And then you can either hide or show those captions. The captions will also be available in the recording, so do keep an eye out for that. I will just note that it is automatic captioning and it does struggle sometimes with non-US based accents. So I apologize in advance if some of the words are a bit odd, but generally speaking, it is very accurate. I would also like to point you all to the chat. We encourage an active chat, including comments and questions on the panelists, as well as the topics that we are discussing. Please feel free to put your questions in there. The panelists will keep an eye on things as they are able, as well as I will and my colleagues from Humentum just to keep an eye on things and help pull questions into the conversation. We will also answer questions at the end of the webinar. Additionally, if there's a question you'd like to ask anonymously, you can send that to me privately by changing that to box from everyone to my name, Jessica Walker, and then I can present that question for you. As I said at the beginning, we are recording and you will receive that recording in your inbox later this week. And if you have any other questions, again, please feel free to drop those in the chat. With that, I am very excited to hand it over to my colleague, Ennie Chipembere, who is going to introduce our panelists and get things started.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that. So my name's Ennie Chipembere, and I work with Jessica and the team at Humentum as the Director for Locally Led Development. Very excited to have our panel and all of you who have tuned in to this very important webinar today on operationalizing locally led development. There's a lot to talk about, as always, but also it's an important area of development changes, and that's why we are talking about it. In the preparation leading up to this, part of what the panelists and ourselves were discussing and would like to share today or push for from the panelists as well as yourselves, either in the chat or later on at the end, is really looking at some practical movement where we moved the needle in terms of locally led development. And today we are focusing on two aspects that have a huge bearing on making locally led development a reality, and that's risk and accountability. And our panelists today are really well versed in those two areas. So just a bit of background, part of what we are looking at and we'll be talking about today is how can we rethink current approaches to risk management and accountability, since that's such a critical imperative in operationalizing locally led development, or development that is driven by local actors and local organizations and affected populations. Because the reason why this is important is because current practices also often and continue to prioritize mostly donor requirements at the expense of local context considerations. This is not a blanket statement, but predominantly that's the case. So in this webinar, we really would like to, through the lens of the experience, knowledge, and exposure of our panelists, explore models of how we can rethink, reimagine, and talk about redistributing operational risk management among donors, implementers, and other stakeholders in a way that removes barriers to those who are in local contexts and new partners, and in a way that is true to the spirit and vision of sustainable, equitable, locally led development. So we'll also, in the same vein, examine models of accountability to affected populations that transform the efficacy and impact of donor-funded development, humanitarian assistance, and how this can help also with managing risk. So before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to say the format we'll take in doing this is, one, we would like our panelists to help with framing the issue. So why focus on risk and accountability when it comes to operationalizing locally led development? So we may not all be quite familiar with the issues, so it's important to have that as a starting point, answering that why question, why is it critical? And then in terms of the operationalizing, making it a reality, how have we been doing this? Right, from different vantage points. And here the emphasis is more on promising practice or any positive results and examples that we are seeing that could be shared. And then it's very important to also surface the challenges that need to be noted, as well as proffer some solutions or maybe a call to action for us to move things forward in terms of risk and accountability when it comes to operationalizing locally led development. So that's in terms of just the introduction and the format the webinar is going to take. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. And our first panelist is Riva Kantowitz, founder of a Radical Flexbility Fund. So Riva has, for more than 20 years, worked with human rights, humanitarian, and peace-building organizations around the world. She now focuses on effective support to grassroots social change through partnerships and innovative funding approaches. And it's very important to take note of that particular piece, because there are many different ways that development is funded, resourced, or supported. And it would be good to hear from Riva how the Radical Flexbility Fund works with stakeholders and clients to make funding approaches more innovative. So part of the way they do it, which I hope she'll speak to, and in practical ways, is that they do have some radical actions that they have defined, I think 10 of them, that help with making sure that the funding is in a way supportive of local knowledge, is in a way supportive of new approaches, and is in a way supportive of the need for flexibility of some funding lines. So that's Riva, who is nicely waving at everybody, our first panelist. I'm going to introduce all the panelists and circle back to Riva, so that when we start the flow of the discussion, we are not disturbed with the introductions. So just to make sure everybody's clear about that as I go through people who are going to help us with this conversation. Our second panelist is Bonaventure Sokpoh. He is Senior Advisor at Core Humanitarian Standards and Outreach, CHS Alliance, and he leads on the localization, strategy development and implementation, strengthening national NGOs membership with the Alliance, but also using the use of the Core Humanitarian Standards. And this is in terms of accountability. So quite interested in getting some practical examples of how the Core Humanitarian Standards are being used to operationalize locally led development with national NGOs. What are some of the promising practices, where are challenges, and what can we learn? What are the lessons and insights from an accountability perspective? And I do remember that CHS Alliance promotes downward accountability. So that's an alternative to upward accountability, but I'm sure Bonaventure will speak to some of that. And smiling as well, our panelists are happy to be here. So looking forward to hearing more from you around the standards, accountability, and how you've been working with national NGOs. Our third panelist is Amy Muller-Taylor. She's Chief Strategy Officer at Civicus and also Vice Chair of the Board of AccountableNow. So in her current role at Civicus, Amy provides strategic leadership on civil society resourcing, effectiveness and innovation, and constituency-based accountability. So we did say we want to rethink models of accountability. So it would be wonderful to hear from Amy, both from the Civicus approach and model of accountability that challenges and tries to give an alternative to other traditional models of accountability, as well as her work with AccountableNow, where they practice dynamic accountability. So looking forward to hearing more about what dynamic accountability is and how these alternatives have been supportive of locally led development and national or local actors. So Amy, will be circling back to you for that. And last but not the least of our panelists is Lydia Nylander. Lydia Nylander, she is Acting Division Chief, Office of the Chief Financial Officer within USAID. So just to give a little brief on what the Office of the Chief Financial Officer does. So this office establishes and maintains sound financial management practices through the timely collection and dissemination of accurate financial information, advisory, and analytical services to USAID partners and other constituents. So when it comes to the issue of risk, I do know from the briefing we had that Lydia has quite extensive experience in terms of, you know, what are the different types of risks, both traditional and emerging ones, you know, as well as risk information that they are collecting, how that is used in terms of promoting locally led development and strengthening local partners as well. So welcome, Lydia, who will complete the circle of our panelists today, and really appreciative of all of you being here and looking forward to your inputs. And as I said in the format, it's very, very important that we from your perspective and your experience and where you are positioned, you help us frame the issue and answer the why. And in answering the why, we also want to then say, how do we actually then operationalize, right? And what is some promising practice? Like we really need some hope and some positivity. So we've got examples. We are here for examples as well, to learn from those, but also to learn, you know, they say, you know, in failure, we gain stepping stones for the next trial. So where you've had lessons, where things have been tried, haven't worked, we want to also hear about that so that we shorten the learning curve of all the innovative things that we are trying in making locally led development a reality. and also what are the challenges and what could be points of future direction, particularly those like Lydia who are in policy formulation kind of positions. If you can give us some pointers, that would be so useful, because people are always trying to also see where is the lay of the land going. So I'll start with you, Riva, right? And just your opening question and framing, and to get us started in terms of, first of all, I'm sure people would really want to hear a little bit more about the fund, but how do issues of risk manifest in locally led development? How do issues of risk manifest in locally led development? And what is the Radical Flexibility Fund's approach to risk management in such a way that we get some examples from you of concrete changes that you've been seeing as well as supporting. So if you could just start with that framing for us, and then how the Radical Flexibility Fund is working to operationalize locally led development. And in the next round, we'll circle back to maybe challenges and recommendations or something like that. But for now, help us with that framing and some examples from your work.
Great. Thank you so much, Ennie. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone from New York City, and thrilled to be kicking off our conversation. I'll share just a little bit about Radical Flexibility Fund. Ennie gave a great overview, and you'll find 10 radical actions on our website, as she said, and then just share maybe one or two thoughts about kind of examples and framing questions. So I lead a new organization called Radical Flexibility Fund, as we said, where we create more impactful and sustainable pathways for donors to invest in local development and social change initiatives. So how do we do this? We do this by bringing together leaders and innovators from different parts of the donor and social change fields to develop and also demonstrate that there are more effective resourcing alternatives for civil society than our current model. And our approach has 3 pillars. And again, they're summarized in 10 radical actions. First, we test funding tools that are more flexible, inclusive, and sustainable than grants. We're not anti-grant, but we are trying to understand other approaches that we may take that actually create sustainability. Second, we believe that you can't just use new tools without doing so in the service of communities' priorities and communities' understandings of impact. And then finally, what we are here today to talk about, really demanding, and I use that word intentionally, that funders be accountable to communities they serve rather than, primarily their boards or parliaments. And so speaking of risk, this really requires that we move from a risk management perspective to risk sharing, and from an approach that's based mostly on control, and I would argue false ways of thinking about control, to building relationships based on trust. As Ennie said, what's the argument for doing this? Well, I would ask, what is the argument for not doing this? We are getting less than 4% of our global funding directly to local organizations. Therefore, we are under-resourcing one of the most important levers that we have as a global community to address any of the daunting issues that we face. So, what would happen if we prioritized local solutions and really centered that work in our development models and adequately resourced that work? And so I'll just mention 2 strategies that we've undertaken. And one of them is to really encourage funders around the R&D piece, to dedicate resources to a venture capital approach where we try a range of strategies, including all of these different approaches to resourcing beyond grants, to support locally led development. And we actually expect that a portion of those will fail. And again, as Ennie said, we learn, we develop a learning agenda that doesn't penalize us for failing, but learns from those processes about how we really can shift this whole paradigm to center local work. You know, some of them, as I said, some of them may fail, but we may also dramatically increase that 4% and most importantly, improve impact. The second thing I'll mention is that we really need to address these pervasive assumptions about issues like risk that in the 25 years I've been doing this, I have not seen any evidence for. So, you know, one way that we do this is to try to ask better questions. So again, back to 10 radical actions. Each of the 10 actions raises a set of questions that we hope both funders and local organizations will undertake to really systematically interrogate how they are doing this work. And I will, for this conversation, you know, in the framing, I think the most central question that we can ask is who is assuming the risk here? Who, you know, what is the risk to funders? Their reputation may be affected. They may lose resources. You know, funders are also taking the risk of being ineffective by not investing adequately in local solutions. And they may not be really taking an adequate an appropriately balanced approach to risk when you think about the risks that local organizations assume. They risk their livelihoods, they risk the well-being of their community, and in some of the human rights work that we do, they risk their lives. So, you know, we really need to take a more balanced risk assessment framework. And I will end by raising one other point, again, which the risk piece ties into this fallacy that if funders have control, and the way that we have operationalized that idea of control is through monitoring and reporting, you know, then risks can be mitigated and outcomes will be strengthened. And again, we operationalize that control through processes, you know, that probably at one point served a purpose, but have now really become misaligned with utilizing resources effectively. Is it efficient to save every receipt? You know, not to mention that really puts that if you ask for a $3 taxi receipt in many parts of the world, immediately you are being funded by an international organization. So, you know, we really need to re-examine some of the processes and procedures that have just become par for the course in how we think about risk management. And so I have a couple of examples of, you know, the way funders are managing this differently, but I will stop there for now and Ennie, turn it back to you and our other fantastic panelists.
Thank you so much, Riva, for framing, sharing a little bit about the 10 radical actions and posing quite strategic questions around, you know, from an approach to risk that is about control to an approach to risk that is about partnership, that is about shared risk, and also bringing into the conversation the issue of really adequately resourcing local solutions, right? So within Humentum, we've done some research around how some of the funding models and conditionalities and requirements is like a starvation cycle to local NGOs. So definitely some great questions that you've posed there that will circle back with the panel, but also even with the participants. So as I said, I want to give an opportunity as you all present to also get some questions, one or two from the participants, so that as we are going along, we are answering some of the emerging issues. So we have a question in the chat from Patrick Merriweather, and he says, in a given community, there would likely be a wide variety of objectives and priorities. How do we choose which are to be funded? How do you avoid amplifying local, in brackets, disadvantages and disparities? You could start with responding to that, Riva, and if any of the panelists want to add that from their experience within the context of still locally driven development, just get us started and we might get other inputs as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think the answer is being vigilant and constantly asking who gets to be at the table, you know, who gets to actually decide on these priorities, who has been included in a process that has surfaced these priorities. The way that we've handled this, you know, in the year plus, we're very new we've been doing this work. The way that we've handled this is by testing our approach with specific groups of stakeholders. So for example, migrant-led organizations, or, you know, organizations that are working, we don't focus on a particular thematic issue. We really focus on, you know, getting resources generally to grassroots organizations working on a whole range of development, peace building, humanitarian issues. But within that, so far, you know, we've worked with more finite groups of organizations and funders that are working on a specific set of issues. And so it's a little bit narrower. It makes it a little bit easier to decide on priorities within a particular location and in a particular issue area.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Riva, for pointing that who is at the table, who is setting the agenda and the priorities, because that's one of the issues that is really a challenge in terms of operationalizing locally led development, that the people who are affected by humanitarian disasters, for example, right, are not actually sitting in the coordination meetings, or there is no mechanism for them to be part of coordination meetings that make decisions around, you know, what's going to be allocated where, and how does, you know, reporting on impact and all those things actually happen. I don't know, Bonaventure, if you want to chime in terms of this particular question as it relates to that downward accountability area that I know CHS Alliance is very interested in.
Thank you very much, Ennie, for that. I'm jumping on this question. This is a very interesting and a good question, because I have to say I spent a lot of time working on participation within the communities, and I have been myself. I experienced being a refugee in my life, so I get the sense of this question. This is very important, and all my passion in working with organizations to strengthen the way they are engaging with people are based on my own experience and everything that I have heard throughout my career, sitting with people we are trying to serve. So this question is very important, because everything that you are trying to do, if I say engage with people, let them take decision in your program, then we also know that there are systems in place that can create marginalization of some of the groups. And from experience, what we want to put forward on that is, I would say, for an organization working in a community, you need to have a proper strategy and engagement needs understanding the community, knowing them, creating an open space for communication. By knowing them, by sitting, by being humble with them, you and your teams will be able to understand the structure in the community, negotiating access to those who are being marginalized. It's not that to come and say only the project or initiative that are visible to jump on them. I think if you do, then you are exacerbating the marginalization in the community. We have seen, for example, in some countries, you arrive or in a refugee camp, for example, and the people start connecting only with those who can speak international languages, because, yeah, naturally we can communicate with them, but we forget others who are playing, who have power, who are playing another kind of power in the communities that we don't see if we don't take time to understand it, to connect with them. So the key for me is to have a proper strategy in the organization to engage in this two-way communication. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that you will just get it, but if you have the strategy and the resources. You provide skills to your staff, and you take the necessary time to connect with these people. You will get to a certain point to reduce this marginalization and knowing which initiative to support in the communities. I will stop there for now and maybe come back to for other experiences and idea to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonaventure, for that. We have some great inputs and as well as questions in the chat that we'll come back to. I would like to give an opportunity to our next panelists in terms of framing the conversation from an accountability perspective. And that would be you, Bonaventure, back in the spotlight. And you had already started giving us some ideas, right, around how it's important to really spend time with the community as part of getting to know them and as part of also understanding local solutions. So maybe start by framing for us, because there are some people who may not know about the CH Alliance or even the standards. Start by framing for us, how do issues of accountability manifest in locally led development, in making locally led development a reality? And what's the practice that CHS Alliance is promoting whilst working with national NGOs? And how can this actually be improved to help with the thorny issue of accountability that comes with some funding conditionalities? So frame that for us, and then we'll come back to a question that's already waiting for you in the chat around accountability.
Great, thank you again, Ennie. I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I want to start by saying, when at the CHS Alliance, or CHS Alliance is a global network of humanitarian and development organizations who are all committed to make aid work better for people we are serving through the application of the core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability. And as you asked me to set that, I will say a few words on the core humanitarian standard that we refer to as CHS. It's a standard that sets 9 commitments. It's 9 commitments that are set in this standard. These commitments are made to people we are serving. So we put at the center the communities and people we are serving in their environment. So these commitments are for everyone engaging with vulnerable people in humanitarian development setting, that we want to do something that is of quality and accountability. And these have been designed from communication with these people to see what are important for them. We believe that the CHS is covering the essential element of the humanitarian work. So I want to say how at the CHS and CHS Alliance we look at accountability. We look at it as a process of using power responsibly, taking account of and being held account by different stakeholders, and primarily those who are affected by the exercise of such power. So you see this element of power, using the power and letting ourselves be held accountable by people we are trying to save. I refer to humility at the beginning. You might be able to do that if you are humble enough to be held accountable. So when we are talking about accountability and risk, I will say, I will put it in 2 ways. We will need to be accountable or manage the risk that we are on people. We want what we call a downward accountability to make that strong. And we also would like to have a kind of accountability in partnership among peers, among partners, and manage the risk among them. If I take, for example, in partnership, you will see that, okay, between partners, you will be are afraid of having of poor delivery of services if you don't have don't build the trust. I will refer to what Riva said at the beginning about trust between partners and risk sharing. This needs to be very clear. So we need to construct that very strongly, especially when we are in a situation where partnership between international and national organizations, and international organizations don't have access to the area where the services are. So we need to have a system in place that build this trust between us and diminish the risk of poor delivery or something else that will happen. If you go to the people we are serving, our work can have negative impact on them. So we also need to have something strong to limit, diminish this impact on them. We know about the concept of do no harm, all these things. But at the CHS Alliance, and CHS puts the people and their communities and their environment at the center. So these commitments are making sure that we are not adding any difficulties or negative impact on them. So the importance for us, because I'm leading also on our work to connect with national organizations, we continue to hear the complaints about they don't get access to funds. If you come to getting funds, they are finding difficulty to secure core funding to enable them to invest in their quality and in accountability. We know they will be funded through a project, but they won't get an additional fund to invest in that. We know about this inequality in the relationship between the national and international partners. And something that we hear a lot is because of this lack of trust, they are facing a burden that comes from multiple partner capacity assessment or due diligence from the international partners. So the question for us here that we need to really tackle is how do we create a good system of accountability among us, trust among us, avoiding the negative impact on people, but creating this trust in the way that we reinforce the complementarity. And what I see, this is where the CHS and my passion on the CHS is coming from, because I see in the CHS all these elements. And if this is applied by everyone, connecting with people, first we know we will protect them, we put them at a safe place, we will respect these people, and we will help them to bring back their dignity or keep it, because this is what is it about. And this is also helping to create this trust among the people, because by using the CHS, we take two partners using the CHS, then they are speaking the same language. Capacities on the ground can be also recognized, because I heard you, Riva, when you were talking, who is managing the risk, because in our work today, everything is coming from international organizations. I would think that we recognize the capacities. They are taking a lot of risk on the ground. They have also capacity to connect. They know the culture, they know the language, they are close to these people. How do we recognize that? This is where I see the CHS playing a very good role, when all the partners are applying the same standard, speaking the same language, and seeing where they are strong, when they are weak, and how they can complement each other to make the whole response strong. Thank you. I will stop there for the moment.
Wonderful. Very in-depth, combining, both what you're doing, lessons, insights, some challenges, and there's some questions to do with accountability there, but before we get to them, I wanted us to hear from Amy in terms of the work that Civicus does, as well as AccountableNow, when it comes to the issue of accountability and operationalizing locally led development. What are some insights you can add to us framing the issue, and maybe some practical examples of what we can draw on as things that we can do differently?
Great. Thank you so much, Ennie. And thanks everyone for showing up. A good step forward in terms of accountability. Just a bit of context. So Civicus is a global alliance of more than 13,000 members in 175 countries, working together to strengthen civil society and citizen action. And as Ennie mentioned, I'm also representing Civicus on the AccountableNow board of directors. And this has been a really important experience for me in terms of shifting how I think about accountability. The AccountableNow theory of change is that we need to transform ourselves as institutions to be able to transform our relationships with the people that we work with, to be able to transform our societies in which we operate, and realize our own kind of missions and objectives. So for me, this is a super compelling argument for why locally led development is important, as well as a clear steer in terms of where our efforts to improve accountability need to begin. And I think, Ennie, you also mentioned this term, dynamic accountability, which is something that's really central to AccountableNow, and it speaks to this kind of transformational relationship between an organization and its varied stakeholders that results from a kind of continuous engagement process. And personally, I love the term dynamic accountability. I'm a bit of an accountability geek, but I've also found that the language of accountability can be really confusing. People interpret it in many different ways. So I think it's also important that we try to talk about accountability in terms of clear communications, listening, inclusion, participation. So what it means in practice. And for Civicus, one of the most important aspects of dynamic accountability is engaging, listening, and responding to the people that we exist to serve. And there's lots of different kinds of operational approaches that we use to facilitate this kind of accountability. So we put a lot of work into trying to make our language and information more accessible. We adopt a variety of feedback mechanisms that help us to listen to our stakeholders. We use reference groups and co-creation methodologies so that the people that we're working with are involved in identifying their own needs and priorities and designing the solutions. We try to use new reporting metrics that include community feedback and storytelling to track progress, that create open spaces for learning, so that the lived experiences of participants is a key indicator of success versus numbers in a log frame. And so, yeah, intermediaries like Civicus who kind of receive donor funding and pass it on to our members and partners, I think we have a really important role to play in listening to the experiences of our members, sharing their perspectives with funders, and negotiating on their behalf so that we can better adapt our rules to their realities. And then, of course, donors also have a really important role to play in encouraging and supporting dynamic accountability, and really within this framework of kind of locally led development as well. So I think donors creating channels and structures for consultation and shared decision-making, and we're talking decision-making in issues that really matter, like who is local civil society and what are those local priorities to be funded? Donors also have an important role to play in investing in institutional strengthening and accountability mechanisms that help local civil society better meet the needs of their communities. And they also have a big role to play in simplifying what can be really complex fund management, and also investing in strengthening the institutional capacity of local actors to manage those funds. And of course, this also improves risk management and compliance by making information more accessible and equipping local partners to better manage funds. So I think it's the notion of dynamic accountability is that we're accountable to multiple stakeholders. And I think we also have a collective responsibility for practicing that accountability kind of across the board. So I'll pause there. I could talk about it all day.
Thank you so much, Amy. I could feel your excitement, and thank you for already giving us what seems like a checklist of really how we can be transformational. The thing I liked and picked from what you're saying is, as an intermediary organization, it's important that you transform yourselves as well. So it's not only about, donors over there or local actors over there. It's also international NGOs or intermediary organizations that are supporting local actors. So that tripartite relationship of stakeholders is quite important to get to. Before I get to Lydia, just a transition question, because I've been holding on to this one for a while. So it says from Meg Kinghorn, when we build the capacity in quotes of local NGOs to be donor compliant, we then make them donor dependent to fund the staff and systems they develop. So the question is, what are the local accountability drivers that can be substituted to localize accountability within their context, right? So supporting and strengthening sustainability. And this is one, Lydia, if you want to start by responding to that, before we get into on framing, that would be great, from lessons and experiences of how USAID has been working with local partners globally. Then others can maybe chime in as well.
Absolutely. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here from sunny Washington. Ennie, thank you so much for this question. I think it's the conundrum of doing something well and then perhaps being funded to a degree that then you're wondering about sustainability and how to keep our prime and and sub partners sustainable within the environment. So I would say that one of the things that we here at USAID have had to really understand is that we have a number of risk management tools, processes, and systems, and those are well known. What hasn't been as well known is how we actually look at risk. And I think one thing that we can point to as USAID is a public document called our Agency Risk Appetite Statement, which I'll talk about a little later. And I can also drop in the chat. And that statement is a fairly reader-friendly document that really categorizes the various sort of key risks and the levels of risks that we would take in any one category. And it also outlines to staff an approach for thinking about risk appetite, where there are opportunities that we want to leverage and enhance. And so the very careful balance of programmatic drivers that we typically have a high risk appetite for versus the very low fiduciary risks that we have and sort of the zero tolerance we have towards inaction on fraud, waste, and abuse are things that we feel as an agency are important to articulate publicly. So we are one of few agencies that has a public-facing risk appetite statement. It's a key document that we think helps illuminate our risk posture, whilst holding ourselves accountable for thinking about our context, the inherent risks, those being opportunities and threats in the work that we do, and really changing the risk conversation to focus more on not the slapping of the risk of compliance exercises, but saying, what are the unique opportunities and threats that we have to be aware of? When we think about risk, the definition that we use here at USAID is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. And that's a very key sea change for us to not always be looking at risks from a negative perspective. And so I think when we think about capacity development, but also risk mitigation, risk management, there's a very careful balance that we need to be striving for, keeping us accountable within USAID, but also ensuring that we are communicative and responsive to the whole array of stakeholders that we that we speak for and that we serve. And so I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more about the risk appetite statement. We've been undergoing a year-long review of that document, but I think it has solidified itself as a key foundational sort of starting point to talk about risk, not just internally within our agency, but also with our stakeholders and partners, as a way to begin the conversation about exploring opportunities as well as mitigating threats.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for already getting into what I was going to ask about USAID risk appetite statement, and sort of like what's the direction and thinking over there. So I would like to invite each of the panelists, right, before we get to more questions from the chat. From what you've heard so far from each other, what would you say are key tensions in the aspiration of locally led development and in the aspiration of transforming risk and accountability, right? And the tension of requirements, right, from those who are providing the funding. So I did hear what you said, Lydia, that, you know, as an agency, you've put yourself out there. You're actually saying we want, I liked the words you used, changing the risk conversation from control, which Riva talked about, slapping the risks, the risk to something else. So what sort of insights are you getting from the conversation so far? So I would like to do a round of maybe about 2 minutes each person. And then from there, we've got about 20 minutes or so that we can open up for others to either take the mic or post some questions. And anyone can jump in and start.
I'm happy to jump in. Circle back to me. This is just a great, rich, reflective conversation. And one of the themes that is jumping out to me and reading some of the also good comments in the chat about compliance requirements, you know, are working within national laws. I think it's important to remember that this conversation, you know, it's not a monolith. I've worked with many local organizations that have been very grateful for the support. You know, I think Amy referenced this, and guidance of, you know, various of the international community, you know, USAID, various other actors that have really helped them to develop systems and processes, you know, that help them be good stewards of resources. So, I think it's important not that there's no good or bad here. I think the central question is again, back to this, the point that I think everyone has made, including Lydia recently, that it's about really shifting our mindset and approach from one of, risk slapping and frankly, patronizing to, one really of partnership. I think, those of us in the international space should enter these conversations based on the assumption that local organizations, again, also want to be good stewards of funding and want to, maximize the impact of the work that they are doing. Why would we start from any other set of assumptions? And in doing that, so much of our discussion, Bona spoke to this, really in a participatory and collaborative, consultative way, understanding what the gaps are in their own risk management frameworks, in their own processes and procedures, from the perspective of local civil society organizations. Where can we be supportive in helping them either find technical skills? Again, KPMG is all over the world. There are international standards for, accounting and compliance, that we don't, I will never forget. I always say this. I was working with a local organization in Kosovo, and not to pick on Lydia, but she said to me, do you think USAID invented accounting? I mean, there are, to the comment that I think, another comment in the chat, we help strengthen the local enabling environment by supporting organizations that are regional or local that are experts on these issues also, that understand the operating environment, right? They live these challenges also. So, we don't have to continue, we need to disrupt this model where, those of us that are sort of operating in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Geneva and London, work from this place, frankly, of mistrust or, the set of assumptions that are incorrect. And we fly in our experts to, impose a certain set of standards or processes. I think it really needs to start with a more collaborative conversation around what local organizations feel they need and how they can best respond given whatever the particular environments that they are working in and the challenges that they face. I'll stop there.
Quite the impassioned speech, Riva. Assume
we're also
positive
excited about accountability.
Assume positive intent as the starting point. And thank you so much for the call to action you've actually made right there. Who wants to get in next with some sort of like reflection? Oh, okay. Go ahead, Bonaventure.
Thank you. I just wanted to react on a point when the point linked to donor-driven and I would say international partner-driven. We have a belief in the Searches Alliance by saying in this debate of localization, whatever you call it, we think strengthening local leadership from local actors. We would like also to say, okay, this is also something that we want to see from local or national actors. And I want to say, I'm so happy to see that in our partnership and membership, we have started to see some local organizations, national organizations, really wanting to take this leadership. If they don't go, then this idea of thinking that something is coming from outside being imposed on them will continue to be there. So we really want them to take the ownership. When we look at you are talking about strengthening the capacities and everything, you have tried to look at the history of it. So you see that the capacity building, all these things, strategies are coming from outside, and some of them will go in the direction that will serve the project and programs of the organization funding this capacity development. What we want to see now is that national and local organizations, they really take this leadership. As you said, Riva, they want to also to be strong and take part of it. And they need to lead it, because if they don't, then they will receive some elements that, yeah, may be useful, but not addressing their priorities. So what we see from organization doing this, and this is, I said, when we are having this discussion, I also want to bring positive experiences in it by saying these are our stars of hopes, and then we see some organizations, they are giving this a testimony by saying, we have used the CHS verification. CHS is a tool that you can use to verify. You have several options. You can do it self-assessment. You just look at yourself and then you do this process. You can also ask another HKI organization to do the assessment for you. But when you have the results, this is where it's becoming very interesting. When the organization gets the results and using this result, the results to say, this is where I have identified my strengths, so see it, recognize my strengths, that's one thing. And this is also where I have identified areas of improvement and want to lead on that. So it's not that an organization will come and say, oh, I want to strengthen your capacities on this, but the priorities are coming from the national organization itself. And we see the CHS verification helping for that strongly. So the CHS is a standard that is for everyone. And then we see national organization, when they take it, they start owning it. It's really changing the balance, the unbalanced power dynamic between them and the partners. So John, I wanted to just underline this point also, and invite local organizations to really take this leadership, be courageous, and we see those who are doing it already, they are getting the result of it. Take this courage, engage yourself in the quality and accountability in the way that is good for you, in your context, in your country, and prove that to the other partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonaventure. You know, Lydia said, changing the conversation. Riva said, you know, changing just the tools, and you come with a tool, you know, CHS Alliance self-assessment. If I assess myself and actually say, this is what I need to change, then I'm inviting you, and I have that ownership and leadership and agency to then work on it in solidarity with you. So we're not trying to topple the system. We are trying to make the system and the ways we do things better. So thank you collectively for making those connections for us. Who wants to go next? Between Amy and Lydia. I
see you've unmuted, Lydia. That's a good sign.
No pressure then. Well, I'm going to echo what I've heard Riva and Bonaventure reference, which is just, you know, as a risk expert based in Washington, I think one of the things is just like we focus on risk from an agency sort of level perspective, and how key risks that float up through our programs and our initiatives, through our missions to our bureaus, are impacting our programming and operations. And so oftentimes conversations about risk, if you are looking at things from a very risk adverse versus a risk balance perspective, are often about sort of red lights, right? You know, if you think about, you know, do not enter, you do not pass go, that type of conversation. And what I have found is that COVID-19 for risk managers has presented a unique opportunity to discuss risks from a more neutral perspective. So whilst scenario planning and other types of risk mitigations related to pandemics may have been thought about, the dimensions and the velocity of key risks that develop during the pandemic, and which are still here, were possibly not thought about from a programming or a technical portfolio perspective. And so I think, again, this is a key opportunity to have conversations about risk, which are not about you are doing something wrong, but exploring the pathways, understanding the inherent environment, understanding how our partners operate. And I think that those conversations are really key. Another area that I would sort of mention is really just thinking about how we use risk information. So again, not using it in silos. As you can see, we, in the risk appetite statement, we have about 8 categories listed there. They're not exclusively the only risks that we look at, but those are our chief ones. And within those categories, there are, actions or activities that we, point our staff and our stakeholders to that blend the balancing of risks. So there are things where we would definitely lean into certain activities around innovative practices and co-design and co-creation, versus obviously, we've got to have pretty strong, robust risk mitigations around mismanagement and abuse of funds. So I think what you're seeing now is a conversation around risk that isn't just centered around local organizations doing something wrong, but really take into consideration the flavor and the inherent environment that we are, and the context in which we work. And I think that that's the best place to start to frame those conversations as an ongoing engagement and partnership model. I think we also have to recognize that if we want to have new and non-traditional partners, we at USAID need to lean into how we invite and how we talk about the way that we work and how to engage with us, recognizing that some of that is mandated and that we have stakeholders like Congress and other things. But a one-stop shop, like, work with USA.gov, for example, where all of our resources are available, some of them are available in different languages, I think is just one small step in ensuring that when we talk about risk, that we're ensuring that people have as much information about how we look at risks as possible.
Lots of good stuff there, and for people to take on and then make use of as information coming out of the portfolio that Lydia is part of. And I really liked ongoing engagement and partnership model, because it echoes what Riva was talking about, that, when we are thinking about risk, even accountability, really let's look at co-creation, let's look at partnership. And the baton comes to you, Amy.
Thanks, Ennie. I now realize I've put myself in an impossible position of trying to somehow have a cohesive response. But I want to go back, I think, Ennie, to what you were talking about in terms of the tensions in making these shifts, and Riva's idea of kind of changing mindsets, and Bonaventure's point on owning these processes, as well as the kind of opportunities that Lydia shared. And for me, the tension is that there are new models, there are approaches that we can learn from and adopt that would improve risk sharing and accountability. And yet none of these will work without quality relationships that are built on trust. And this requires time and commitment, when I think most of the people on this call will say we're already short on time and overcommitted, right? It means that we have to be more flexible and open to experimentation. And again, to do that, we need equally flexible funding, which is hard to come by. It means that we have to have more kind of reflective, ongoing learning, which means that we need to be opening to listening to and hearing our critics and our friends. And it also means we have to be much more intentional in terms of addressing the power imbalances that are manifested in decision-making and language and behavior. I think Bonaventure's examples that he was providing are really important there. And of course, this means that we have to kind of keep our egos in check and recognize the knowledge and the experience that local actors bring that are going to improve our own impact. So I think there are a lot of tensions there in terms of being aware of what we need to do to change and really kind of taking all that involves on board. And I think, I mean, from a Civicus perspective, we've been incredibly privileged to have funding partners who understand what it takes to be accountable. And they've invested in this work because it is work. And they've given us flexibility to test and learn in an experimental and iterative way. And I think the challenge is to expand this support to local groups and actors who are already struggling to access the funds they need to do their work. So there is, I think, a kind of a necessity of that transformation that I spoke about in the beginning to realize all of this potential and excitement that I've heard on the conversation today.
So centering power and relationship building. So addressing power imbalances that inherently come with the development project. So we have maybe about 15 minutes or so to go. And I wanted to, instead of sort of taking the mic or giving the mic to someone, there are some questions that were posted like right from the beginning. And I think there's one, you can go through them, the chat will be shared, but there's one that I think would cut across all your areas of expertise, interest, and experience. And this one is from Abdallah M. Thank you for your question. And it says, how will the localization strategy, vision, agenda, or approach and funding sustainability go hand in hand? So that tension again. So I think there's a theme there around certain tensions that we need to work through. Any one of you could try and respond to this one. So the vision versus the reality of funding sustainability. It's a big one. That's why I chose it. What are some examples? How are maybe national NGOs or local actors that you know trying to have some sustainable funding? Because right at that resource issue is where the challenge is around power and having autonomy to make decisions, to lead the agenda and push back. Do we have any examples that could respond to this question?
May I jump in?
Of course.
Yeah, I think I see different type of collaborations on the ground. Some of them you see international organizations having long-term partnership with some of the organizations on the ground. So in this setting, you will see we can hope and expect sustainability of funding in this setting because they are working together for long. And this is where they can create this. And we see, for example, we start to see some initiatives, many initiatives from international organizations. Together Project is one. There are many, and they are started to say we have a group of organizations that we will be working with in different countries to make sure that there is a clear dialogue between them to create this movement of improvement in making them strong, but also confirming long-term partnership. This is good. This is working for some of them, and then I think this is a good thing that we should push for. And there is another aspect of this when somebody is saying, yeah, all these things are good, but when the resources are not there, what do you do? And I want to respond to that by saying there is something I'm discussing, and then I'm hearing some testimony from organization. Let me give you an example. I don't want organization, don't want to see them all the time donor dependent. For example, somebody will say to engage on the self-assessment process or to engage on any verification, we need funds. But those who have started doing it without waiting for an international organization to fund them, they are having a pace forward and with that. But I'm not also saying that we need to leave the organization without any capacities, because if you have identified your weaknesses, you will probably need resources to make the improvement. This is where we are coming to revisiting our partnership agreement and collaboration, and making sure that in these capacities, in this agreement, we have the sustainable funding. We have overhead costs for the organization. We understand where the priorities are as an international organization to make sure that they are strengthened. This is where the intermediaries' role is coming very strong. And then I like what he said about as local as possible, as international as necessary. I really like that, because if you want to put that into practice, then we need to look at, as an international organization, to look at our way of engaging with this national organization, revising them, making sure that we play our role in the value that we are adding to the work that national organizations are doing on the ground, and the value they are adding. In this way, we can really create this, I would say, successful partnership, because everyone will play its role very strongly and channel the funds to the organization, strengthen them, and they reinforce their capacity to do the work on the ground, because they are closer to the people we are serving. They have all the value and capacity. We can count on them. I like something that people say, when the crisis the situation gets worse, they are not evacuating. They will stay there. If they have the capacity, then the response is of better quality. So these are the things that I can give as contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bonaventure. Just flagging to you, Riva, there's a request in the chat if you could post more information about venture capital approaches. So that would be great. And flagging to, thanking Emmy, first of all, for the tons of resources links you shared, and just pointing out a thread or an area that has been mentioned by a couple of contributors in the chat around the risk sort of like assessment measure of requesting for receipts, particularly in remote areas. So there are a lot of comments there around receipts. We don't have time to really go into it, but it seems like to be a point of issue. And And maybe Lydia, that's something you could take to your counterparts around. When you say changing the conversations, it's also changing the tools that we use for assessing risk and also accountability. So I just wanted to pull that from the chat as well. And there is a question there that we might want to also take into our spaces around compliance requirements. I think it ties into that receipts issue, that the evidencing is an area that we might want to really think about. You know what, and I'm particularly still looking at you, Amy, since you are in that accountability and learning space. How do we evidence things? Because I remember you mentioned something about different ways of evidencing. That was a point that I picked up from you, that we need to think, co-create ways of evidencing that work both for local actors, which is good downward accountability, but also can work for donor requirements where there is a mandate. I do remember Lydia pointing out that we have to recognize that some of the resources are mandated in a particular way, so we can't run away from that. I just want to, we've got like 10 minutes, give each of you again an opportunity. You've done brilliantly. Thank you so much in framing the issues. You've done wonderful in giving us some tools around the how. The conversation was around how do we radically rethink. And I think the checklists you were giving, you know, the pointers you were mentioning, the policy briefs and papers that are out there from USAID, you know, the CHA's self-assessment, Accountable Now checklist as well, and from Flexbility Fund. Thank you so much for what you've shared. So I just want, on the last piece, you mentioned the challenges, some really big ones, the tensions we have to grapple with. I want to give each of you 2 minutes as part of closing to have, what's the takeaway? What should people be thinking about as we leave this conversation? And I want to challenge you, because you said it's about not more talk, but how do we practically move the needle? And I'm taking notes of the practical things that you're suggesting or recommending to move the needle, not only for those who are listening in the audience, but even for Humentum as well, as we are strongly committed to really pushing for equitable development that is locally driven. So our whole strategy and theory of change, which you can find on our website and on our social media spaces, is really framed around pushing for that equitable development and locally driven development. So closing remarks, some call to action, some practicalities, whatever you think we need to take away. Yes, Amy.
I'm raising my hand because I can't get past the questions. I thought that was so brilliant. The idea of how do the localization agenda and sustainability fit together. And I think it's a brilliant question, because of course, just giving funds to local actors, that's not going to do your bidding, isn't really creating any kind of sustainable ecosystem. But I think giving flexible funds that are predictable and longer term, that help support the institutional strengthening of local actors, that make them more accountable to their communities, which we know makes them more resilient to financial and other changes. That's the connection, right? So it's, for me, just wanted to use the opportunity to underline that point. And Ennie, you were reading my mind. I was writing as you were speaking, evidencing trust-based giving. I think, again, the idea that, that there's risks and additional risks associated with giving to local actors who are somehow less compliant, it's a perception, right? And I think that we need to challenge that perception with reality by evidencing what it really means to give to local actors. I know from our side, we had a youth action lab where we were giving to youth activists who had minimal kind of institutional systems. They were working in the most challenging environments. They experienced cyclones, war, conflict, infrastructure that was non-existent. And yet, I think at the end of that program, there were $3,000 that were unaccounted for. And it was literally because someone's office had been shelled, right? I mean, it was, just impractical. So I think really challenging what risk and accountability mean and who holds the risk and accountability is also really important. So I answered the questions instead of leaving parting thoughts.
The call to action is let's evidence. The call to action is let's evidence. Thank you for that. Who wants to go next? Yes, Bonaventure.
Yes, thank you. I will continue on what Ennie said. My point, you have heard it, is my call to organization. I will focus this on national and local organization to also play the part of the game, take their role, take the ownership, take the leadership, be courageous in looking at their capacity, improving their capacity to international organization. We cannot just think that national organization will stay there and hope that one day power will be released to them and they will have it. I think my invitation is that let's be as national organization, let's be courageous and play our role. I want to add to that the CHS is a tool that is being used in a way that how do we define the way we work with the people on the ground, our accountability and our quality framework. CHS is providing that before we wait until we feel the pressure from donors, this is the way you should be working. The sector is building this CHS, this tool to work on that. And there is an opportunity now that because CHS is being revised. So one of my great invitation is that everyone needs to take part of this, especially national and local organizations, to make sure that this tool reflects their value and what they are doing on the ground and use it as a tool to prove their capacity and demonstrate their leadership. That might be helpful. And I want also that donors and intermediaries to take part of this. So we all have the same element where we put our values and what we want to see on the ground. I will share a link after this for those who would like to take part of this process of CHS verification, to be involved in it. This is a very important initiative that is going on. And as the CHS Alliance, we are also looking at the verification processes to make sure that this is made more accessible to organizations on the ground. So there are initiatives ongoing, just an invitation to everyone to take part of this and build these strong national communities who will do a great job and serve the people we are in difficult situations. Thank you.
Fantastic, Bonaventure. Lydia, you want to go next, and Riva, you close for us?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm sure Riva has a great rallying cry for us, so I'm happy to share my thoughts. And this has been such a great discussion, and I really thank the other panelists for their candor and what I think is really important conversation as a path forward to sort of co-create and co-mitigate and co-manage. And so, as it relates to USAID's localization agenda, which seeks to fund local actors, 25% of our overall funding for the next 4 years. and to integrate local voices by 50% of all of our programs over the next decade, we're going to have to look at ways that our processes and our actions put local actors in the lead, strengthen local systems, and are responsive to local communities. And the reality of that is just that the risks are evolving all the time. So one active risk that we're looking at right now is the risk of inflation, and how that is permeating through not only our internal sort of planning and implementation, but just externally. So, I mean, I think, again, that's another lens of looking at risks, co-planning, co-designing, co-implementing, co-monitoring, that really allows us to think about how these risks, affect, our stakeholders and overall performance. So we've talked about risk tools, but I think that that's another really important element here. What do risks actually tell us? Are we leveraging opportunities? Are we mitigating threats? Do we understand the root cause, or are we just addressing symptoms? And so, within USAID, we're looking at ways to transform how we look at risk information so that we have a portfolio view on that, focuses on local, regional, technical portfolio and an agency perspective around risk. And then ensuring that we understand operational risks. So turning back to the risk appetite statement, one area that we found was really important to delve into is just operational risk considerations. So not just the theory of change, but what the actual systems, processes, bureaucracies in some sense, what we need to look at from that perspective that's impacting our strategic objectives and performance. And so that's another way of holding ourselves accountable, ensuring that our risk conversations are comprehensive, and that, when we enter into those discussions around risk from a co-design and co-creation perspective, that we have those operational realities at the forefront of our minds. So over to Riva.
Thank you so much. And just, I agree with everything that the panelists have shared. And I just want to make one point, or maybe two, which is that my call to action would really be on leadership around the systems change piece of this. So I'm sure we've all been in a lot of these discussions that involve various really important aspects of locally led development, the localization agenda, shifting power, decolonizing aid, not all the same thing, but all sort of circling similar processes and values. And I don't see where any of this information sits as a collective body of knowledge. So for example, what all of my fellow panelists have just shared about the need for more evidence, the self-assessment strategy that Bonaventure shared, what Lydia was just saying about operational approaches to managing risk, and then this piece around funding. And I have a lot to say about the intersection between localization and sustainability. The heart of what we do is looking at more sustainable tools. So social enterprise, community philanthropy, giving circles, outcome-based financing. There are lots of other approaches. I dropped a link in the chat about that I think represents a new initiative, an example of some leadership from a set of private foundations on challenging project-based funding. This is really the outcome of several years of research, the BUILD program at the Ford Foundation, but it only addresses one aspect of this. And I will close by being provocative and saying what I always say, which is that, you can give the most flexible, unrestricted grant as possible, and it will end. That is not necessarily creating sustainability for local organizations, because they will still be dependent on finding the next grant. So I think this is a great example of thought leadership in this space, but we need to go further and invest more in developing these new strategies and approaches, and finding a place where they all sit, so we can think about each of these aspects and really learn from all of these great approaches and perspectives, as a whole. So I'll close there and just thank you for a fantastic discussion.
Wow, really exciting, lots of affirmation and feedback and appreciation for the rich discussion, your responses, your openness to challenge each other as well as everybody else. And I would just close in terms of this piece of the discussion before handing over to Jessica with one thing that is a thread across, which is, systems change, and ensuring that we have operating models that give autonomy to local actors, local NGOs, to really, really be able to do all the things that we've been talking about. And just a small plug for Humentum, that's what our theory of change is about, really building sustainable operating models that enable local actors to really drive development in an equitable way, in a resilient way, and in an accountable way. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Ennie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a great discussion, and I just want to remind all of the attendees as well as our panelists that there will be a follow-up email later this week. And if you have any questions for the panelists, we'll share contact information as well as all of the wonderful resources that were shared today in that follow-up email. And I just want to say thank you once again to all of you for sharing your time with us today and generating this really interesting and dynamic discussion. Have a wonderful day, everyone.